sound speeds. And if you're a fan of the Deity S-Mic 2 and/or 2S, then pay close attention because I'm going to introduce you to the Deity S-Mic 3 and 3S in this video. But before we get going, full disclosure, Deity did send me both the 3 and the 3S in exchange for a fair and honest review. I do get to keep them following this review, but I'm not going to allow that to affect my opinion, so you'd expect this to be a fair and honest review. For starters, what makes the 3 series different from the 2 series? Well, not much, to be completely honest, but the things that are different make a huge difference. Here's one. On your left is the specs for the S-Mic 2, and on the right, the S-Mic 3. Do you see any difference? There's only one, and it is underweight. The S-Mic 3 is less than half the weight of the S-Mic 2. And how is that a possibility? Because the S-Mic 2 was made of brass and the S-Mic 3 is made of aluminum. For this reason, the S-Mic 2 is advertised as RF immune because it's basically made out of a Faraday cage, but the S-Mic 3 is advertised as RF resistant. Similarly, the specifications for the S-Mic 2S are on your left and the 3S are on your right. Do you see any differences with these? Well, the self noise of the microphone dropped by 3 decibels, and of course, the microphone got lighter by almost half this time. But it's already a very small form factor, so it says a lot. That means that the Deity S-Mic 3 and 3S are combined lighter than one Sennheiser MKH416. And the weight of the S-Mic 2 is the only real issue I had with it, and I said so in my S-Mic 2S video. The S-Mic 2 is a little on the heavy side with regards to shotgun microphones, but the S-Mic 2S makes up for that by being extra light. The S-Mic 2 series came in a big honkin' case. Now let me ask you, on the inside you'll notice that there is just a microphone, a foam windscreen, and a microphone clip. But which of these things requires this level of protection? None of it, actually. Now, the microphone here is the only thing that you might want to protect. And this case is one that once you open up the microphone and you take it out, you're probably not going to put the microphone back in here unless you're going to be selling it. Which is why I love the approach they took with the S-Mic 3 case. On the inside here, you'll have the foam windscreen and the clip, the same as you did on the S-Mic 2, but the microphone now has its own small little bitty case, and the microphone's on the inside, and this protection is really all you need. At a glance, you know exactly what's inside of both of these boxes, and the microphones are all you need protection for. The foam windscreen and the clip aren't going to break if you throw them in a bin. As for RF resistance, I threw multiple frequencies in the 500, 600, and 900 megahertz bands. I even touched the antenna of the transmitter directly to the microphone with no effect. I also did the same thing with 2.4 gigahertz wireless and my cell phone. Absolutely no effect on the S-Mic 3. With that said, I think it's about time for us to do some microphone testing, but first, the shock mount that we're going to be using for this test is the Deity ASM2 Pro. I actually really like this shock mount. First of all, when you slide your microphone in there, you can get it to lock in place however you would like to, and then using these little rubber pieces, you can make it grab hold of your microphone so that way it's not going to slip in and out anymore. Well, I mean, you can force it, but it's not going to really have an issue with grabbing hold of it at all. Then once you're done with that, you can slide the cable in the side here for strain relief purposes, and whatever angle you would like, you can marry it that way. And then you can add whatever angle you would like to the XLR connector. And if you look at this and say, well, geez, Alan, that's really wobbly. That's not very stable at all. Well, once you add it to the bottom of a boom pole and you screw it in there, it pulls right in and no longer does it move. So it's locked in place. So you can adjust with the knob, making it go whatever angle you would like to, and it's going to be extremely useful in pretty much every type of scenario. I've been using this for a while now and have had zero handling noise issues with it. The only thing I'm not so fond about with this shock mount is the yellow cable, the yellow rubber, but I know it's Deity's color scheme and they're very happy with it. But personally, I don't like to put anything on the end of my boom pole that could be in a reflection if there's a piece of glass reflecting the set back at us. But that's really it. Now, with that said, let's do some testing. We're going to start out with the Deity S-Mic 3, which is currently about 1 foot away from my mouth or so and pointed directly at Interstate 85 behind me at rush hour. There's also a road over there, so this is going to be an ideal test to see how well it rejects out outside noises. Now we swapped over to the Deity S-Mic 3S. It's about 1 foot off of my mouth, just like it was with the S-Mic 3, and this is how it sounds in this configuration. If we were doing ENG style audio and coming up from underneath, this is approximately how it would sound like with the microphone about 2.5 feet away from my face. Now we're coming up from underneath ENG style, just like we did with the S-Mic 3. But this is the S-Mic 3S, and it should have a lot more background noise than we were hearing before with the S-Mic 3. Same thing, but this time the microphone is about 2.5 feet away from my face and coming from overhead. So this is also another type of ENG type scenario. Now the S-Mic 3 is in the configuration where it's kind of coming up over the top of camera, but still trying to keep its distance and keep shadows off of people. And it's about the same distance off of my mouth as it was when it was the S-Mic 3. The S-Mic 3 is now right over the top of my head, pretty much even in fact. This is a best case scenario for how it could possibly sound. So this is as good as it's gonna get. The S-Mic 3S is directly on the top of my head. If you were holding the top of my head, this would be barely out of frame. This is a best case scenario for a microphone, especially in a noisy environment like the one that we're shooting in. This is our second best scenario where the microphone is about 6 inches over the top of my head. Now the S-Mic 3S is about 6 inches over the top of my head, and here is how it sounds out here in this noisy environment. Now the S-Mic 3 is about 1 foot over the top of my head, and yes, my voice is a little bit on the loud side. But if someone's recording in a loud environment like this, usually talent is going to speak up just a little bit. Now the S-Mic 3S is about 1 foot over the top of my head, and here is how it sounds in this noisy environment. Actually, traffic died down temporarily, so it's not as loud as it could be. And now the S-Mic 3 is about 18 inches over the top of my head. We're starting to get higher and higher, and as we get higher, you're going to start to hear more of the noises around me and less of my actual voice. The S-Mic 3S is 18 inches over the top of my head. This is how it sounds as it's starting to get to the edge of the range you'd really want to use this short interference tube version in this environment. Now that the microphone is 2 feet over my head, we're experiencing an anomaly. It is summer in Atlanta in the high 90s with high humidity, and it's actually blowing wind a little bit, which never really happens. Microphone is 2 feet over the top of my head, so I'm having to wait until the wind dies down before we can go up any higher. Now the microphone is about 2 feet over the top of my head. Here's how it sounds as it goes higher and higher overhead, and now at the edge of the range I'd ever want to use it in. The microphone is now 2.5 feet over the top of my head, and you may hear an occasional little bit of wind hit the microphone. I'm sorry, I'm trying to time it where the wind isn't going to be blowing in the middle of a take. But unfortunately, that's the nature of what it is out here. I don't have a better windscreen for this. It's using the stock windscreen, and the microphone is 2.5 feet over the top of my head at this distance. Now at 2.5 feet over the top of my head, the S-Mic 3S is now going to be picking up more background noise than its brother, the S-Mic 3. But hey, short interference tubes are going to do exactly that. Now the microphone is about 3 feet over the top of my head, and instead of going up in distances of 6 inches, we're going to now start going up by 1 foot. 3 feet over the top of my head. Here's how the S-Mic 3S sounds in this noisy environment when my voice is at the volume that it is. Now the S-Mic 3 is about 4 feet over the top of my head. As we get higher and higher, we're going to start to hear more and more of the background noise start to come in. As of right now though, you're probably still picking up my voice fairly decently. At least I hope so. We're continuing higher and higher overhead, and we just got into our second segment on this QP5150 ambient boom. As we get higher and higher, it's going to start getting louder and louder. Now the microphone is about 5 feet over the top of my head. You're going to start to hear more and more background noise, and you might even hear mosquitoes that are now starting to eat me alive. Yet another foot overhead, and yet closer and closer to this sweet spot on the rush hour traffic that we're going to start to run into a lot of right behind me on Interstate 85. Now the microphone is about 6 feet over the top of my head. At this point, if I wasn't speaking as loud as I am, it may be a little bit more difficult for you to hear me. And to give you an idea, this is a normal speaking voice for me. If I'm not speaking in like my regular kind of volume, and if I was speaking just kind of at a casual volume, this is the way it would sound. Traffic is getting louder and louder, and the microphone is going higher and higher up. It's getting worse and worse out here. But luckily, there's an area right now where the wind is completely still. I'm really appreciating that part at least. But because I am me, I speak loud. And now the microphone is 7 feet over the top of my head, and here is how it sounds. I'm surprised actually that the wind is as bad as it is out here right now. It's probably because we're recording, because most of the time in Georgia, the wind doesn't blow in the summer when you want it to, only in the winter when you don't want it to, because you're trying to keep your warmth close to your body. As we go higher and higher, I start to forget how high this distance is. But I can count it in post because I know I'm going up in 1 foot increments. So on the screen, you're seeing how high it is. A lot has changed in this exterior noisy location since the last time I shot here. Over the past couple of years, I've seen people dump furniture, trash, and everything. It's been pretty bad over here. But only a few months ago, it cleared up. I don't know why, but it did, and I'm very appreciative of that, so we're able to use our same location we've used like we did on the S-Mic 2. The microphone is getting higher and higher, yet my volume is still staying on the loud side, but it's staying consistent. I'm trying to keep it more or less the same volume as we go higher and higher up. The one thing I have not done is adjusted the gain on my recorder up there. The S-Mic 3S, though, is probably picking a lot more background noise up if you were to compare it to the S-Mic 2 at the same exact height. I'm sorry about that, but it's the nature of a small interference tube shotgun microphone. This would be better used indoors or in very close type scenarios. I know there's wildlife in the woods directly to my left, your right. And I know this because I heard something scamper around a second ago and it caught me by surprise because I don't know what it is. Another big change to this location since the last time I shot here is that there was a bunch of trees back there, but now they've all been taken down and there's now a warehouse with a bunch of loading docks. So I don't hear anything from that direction right now because it's probably being drowned out by Interstate 85 and the traffic directly behind camera. As I go higher and higher overhead, I can't help but wonder if I'm gonna encounter any kind of bugs from the ground. Not just the flying variety, but if I'm gonna stand on an anthill or something and they're gonna start coming up and attacking me. Higher and higher overhead we go. Are you still able to hear me on this S-Mic 3S? I would like you to tell me in the comments below exactly where you think this microphone is no longer effective. Is it different than the height it was on the S-Mic 3? The S, it has a shorter interference tube, so it's probably not gonna be able to reach out nearly as well amongst this background noise. Higher and higher overhead we go, and yes, in case you're wondering, I am bringing up the volume in post louder and louder as the microphone goes higher and higher because the sound mixer would do exactly that. They're not just gonna let the volume fall down into the oblivion, they're gonna bring it up so that way there's a decent level for you to listen to. I'm very grateful that there is a cloud directly overhead. It's a gray cloud, it is just sitting there, probably because the wind that's been blowing down here is not blowing those clouds up there. I was expecting it to be very, very sunny and just terrible out here, but I'm being very, very happily surprised by that dark cloud right there. So, yay! We're now at the second to last segment on this Ambient 5150 boom pole, which I do have a review if you'd like to check it out right there. But for right now, we're about to go even higher. We're now in our final section of this Ambient QP5150 boom pole. We only have a few more heights to go, and I hope the camera doesn't overheat again because that would really suck as far as I'm concerned. I don't think I've ever taken a microphone this high in this noisy location before. So you're getting to see an anomaly here with this Ambient QP5150 and the Deity S-Mic 3. This is how it sounds. Even higher we go still, and as we approach 20 feet over the top of the ground, it's gonna be very far away from my mouth, and it's gonna sound very distant as well. I'd also be lying if I didn't point out that I'm getting extremely hot, and I wanna get into the air conditioning as well. So the break did me some good too, but I only have a couple more tests, and then I'm gonna be in for the drive home. Traffic behind me has gotten a little bit quieter in the past couple of moments, and that's a good thing. Unfortunately though, the wind has been up and down a little bit. Right now, it seems to be fairly cooperative. So we're gonna go up a little bit higher and see how well it does. This is probably gonna be our second to last height with the Deity S-Mic 3. I hope you're able to hear my voice fairly decently over all this traffic behind me, but time will tell and I'll know definitely when I get into post, but you're hearing it now, so you tell me. The microphone is so much higher than you would ever want to use it in a noisy environment. I'm sorry you're having to listen to this, but luckily we only have one more stop. We're now full stick at the end of this Ambient QP5150. This boom pole is right at about 21 feet long, and so the microphone is around about 15 feet over the top of my head, and this is how it sounds. You tell me if it's holding up fairly decently despite all this noise. We're now full stick on the QP5150 boom, and the wind is calm down here. Hopefully it's calm up there too. This is the highest. We're gonna take the S-Mic 3S, and if you're still able to hear me decently, then tell me in the comments below, because honestly, I'd be very surprised if you would actually use anything this high with this microphone. As of right now, I'm in a pretty quiet environment, aside from the birds and the boys over there screaming. So there's really no reason for me to speak up very loud because most of the time actors aren't going to either. So this is the S-Mic 3S at the top of my head. This is the S-Mic 3S, and we're now in this very quiet environment. It's even to the top of my head, and here is how it sounds. The S-Mic 3 is about 6 inches over the top of my head, and this is the first stage as we start to go higher and higher overhead. Now approximately 6 inches over the top of my head, this is how the S-Mic 3 sounds when I'm not speaking overly loud. Now roughly about 1 foot over the top of my head, and again, I'm not speaking very loud, really no reason to, so we're gonna go up even higher, but first the S-Mic 3S. Now approximately 1 foot over the top of my head, the little boys are no longer loud over there, and the birds are not currently chirping, so here's how it sounds. Now approximately 18 inches over the top of my head, and because this is a quiet environment, and I'm kind of underneath a kind of a awning type thing, shade, I don't really see a reason to speak up overly loud because there is a little bit of reverb in here, but not overly much. Now about 18 inches or 1.5 feet over the top of my head, here's how the S-Mic 3 sounds in this quiet environment. Pretty much 2 feet over the top of my head as of right now, and this is how the S-Mic 3 sounds in a quiet environment. Now 2 feet over the top of my head, the S-Mic 3S is still up high. It's, you know, at arm's reach. It's 2 feet over the top of my head. There it is. Really testing the reach now of the S-Mic 3. I'm not speaking overly loud, and it's about 2.5 feet over the top of my head. Higher and higher we go with the Deity S-Mic 3S. Here's how it sounds when it's basically at the edge of my arm's length, maybe slightly outside. Something like that. In this quiet environment, there's really no reason for me to go higher than about 3 feet over my head because you're not going to. If you're in a quiet environment such as this, most likely it's a more intimate scene, so it's going to be playing more on closer shots anyway. If it's a wide shot, play the lav. And now, just like with the S-Mic 3, this is the 3S now at full stick on this ambient boom pole. Here's how it sounds at this kind of distance in this quiet environment. Now we're in a garage, and I'm going to be speaking at a relatively normal type volume, and there's concrete on the floor, the walls are hard, there's various different things in here. This is how the S-Mic 3 sounds when it's more or less even to the top of my head in this environment. Unfortunately, the refrigerator's on. In a reverby type environment like this, the S-Mic 3S may have an advantage over the S-Mic 3 simply because of the smaller interference tube. It may not reach as deep into the shot. On the other hand, it has a wider pattern, so maybe it's going to be picking up more of the environment. Now approximately 6 inches over the top of my head, here's how the S-Mic 3 sounds in this reverberant type environment, and the air conditioner just turned on also. But I can't turn it off because it's 100 degrees outside and the family would kill me. 6 inches over my head, this is a normal level speaking voice, so I don't need to be overly loud, I'm not going to be overly quiet. Here we go, 6 inches over the top of my head, S-Mic 3S. Now 1 foot over the top of my head, here's how the S-Mic 3 sounds in this environment, the garage. Approximately 1 foot over the top of my head, the S-Mic 3S is right now up there catching this room, and you're probably going to hear a lot more reverb as we go higher and higher. Now closer to 18 inches over the top of my head, and speaking at a relatively normal volume, here's how the S-Mic 3 sounds directly overhead. Now 18 inches over the top of my head, the S-Mic 3S is going to be picking up more and more of the reverb as we go higher and higher up. How's it pulling my voice out? Do you think you could fix this in post? Approximately 2 feet over the top of my head, the S-Mic 3 is about just barely out of my arm's length, and here's how it sounds directly overhead on access to my mouth in a garage. Approximately 2 feet over the top of my head, right about there, this is the S-Mic 3S now, directly overhead, straight on access to my mouth, and I'm speaking in a relatively normal type volume. S-Mic 3, directly overhead on access to my mouth in a reverberant type room, and you can hear a lot of the reverb in here. Not quite echo, it is reverb. S-Mic 3S, approximately 2.5 or so feet over the top of my head, directly on access to my mouth, and here is how it sounds when it's this height over my head. Deity S-Mic 3, directly overhead on access to my mouth at the end of the first segment of this ambient QP5150 boom pole, which puts it about 3 feet over the top of my head. Now I say this is about 3 feet over the top of my head. In reality, it's probably a tad bit over, but it is full stick on this ambient QS5150 boom pole, and here is how the S-Mic 3S sounds in a reverberant type room like this, and it is fairly quiet. Now I'm indoors and in a controlled environment, so I don't need to raise my voice and I don't need to have the wind protection anymore, so I'm not going to be using it. It's currently even with the top of my head, and here's how the S-Mic 3 sounds. I'm going to go up while you're listening about 6 inches or so over my head, something like that. And what I will do is I will level match in post, so that way it's going to even out to be about the same kind of audio level as before. And this is 6 inches over my head in a controlled environment, so you're not going to hear a whole lot of reverb or any of that kind of thing. So I'm going to go up even higher now, about another 6 inches. And this is the way the S-Mic 3 is going to sound. Well, I need to not hit the boom pole with this. This is the way the S-Mic 3 sounds directly on access to my mouth, right over top of my face, in access to my mouth, and about a 1 foot over my head, which in a controlled environment like this should sound pretty good. I'm going to go on up to the ceiling, which is pretty much right at about the 1.5 foot mark over the top of my head, and here's how the S-Mic 3 sounds. Now I'm going to ask you to compare the way this sounds right now to the way that the next microphone is going to sound in this controlled environment. But first, I'm going to give you a basis for a comparison. What I'm going to do is angle this. Because I'm in a controlled environment, I'm going to angle it more at my mouth, which is the way that I would actually recommend using it if you're going to be inside of a controlled environment like this. Right now, it would be like the equivalent of it being out of the frame ever so slightly. Maybe I'll angle it downwards just a wee bit, so that way we can really get a good idea. And I'll raise it up ever so slightly. Okay, so if this were, you know, it's right now even with the top of my head. So, but it's angled in at my mouth. So it's literally about 8 inches or so away from my mouth. I'm going to ask you to listen to my voice the way it sounds right now, and then I'm going to switch it out with another microphone for a comparison that hopefully will give you an idea of the way this microphone sounds compared to an industry standard. The industry standard in this case is the MKH416, which everybody pretty much knows. So I want you to listen to this microphone and tell me, did it actually sound different than the Deity S-Mic 3? Now you're listening to the S-Mic 3S in about the same kind of positioning over the top of my head at the same distance. Now, if it sounds different, the reason is because it is a shorter interference tube, therefore my mouth is closer to the capsule. Compare that to the S-Mic 3 and the MKH416. Longer interference tubes mean that if the capsule is closer to the actual microphone portion back here, with the preamps and stuff in it, then it has to go through more length in order to get to my mouth. Therefore, the S-Mic 3S may, in this configuration, in a very controlled environment, sound better than one of the other two, maybe even both. Even with the top of my head and angled straight down in my mouth, this is how it's going to sound. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up about 6 inches or so, and this is the way the microphone sounds in access to my mouth as we start to go overhead. 6 inches away is not that much of a difference spatially in a controlled environment like this. However, it's going to start to make a big difference in the sound because the shorter interference tube is not going to pull in sound directly on axis nearly as much as the other two microphones are. And we're comparing this now to the S-Mic 3. So now I'm about, what is that? About a foot or so over the top of my head. And here is how the S-Mic 3S sounds. Now I'm going to go up even higher so that way you can get an idea of the way it's going to sound when it is approximately, that's about 18 inches over the top of my head, which was about the position that the S-Mic 3 was when I took it overhead. The difference is the interference tube is lower in the microphone than it was before because, again, the microphone is longer when it was the S-Mic 3, so the back of the microphone was closer to the ceiling. It's about that distance away right now, and the interference tube is the same distance away from my mouth as it was before, roughly as much as I'm able to eyeball it here. This is 18 inches. It's about 100 degrees outside, and I am in my car with no air conditioner on, so I don't want to be here very long, but I did want to demonstrate to you what the Deity S-Mic 3S would sound like as a plant microphone inside of a vehicle. Being that it is a low-profile microphone, it is an ideal candidate for you to consider in this kind of environment. And right now, I have it mounted at the end of the S-Mic 3S is mounted at the end of the HDTX, where it is recording. You don't have to do it that way. You can run it on a cable, but if you were to place it barely outside the frame down here, where you normally would outside of a frame, right? You can place it right there, and this is how it's going to pick up. That's a very common location for a plant microphone inside of a vehicle, and it works just fine if you are in this kind of a situation where someone's driving like this and maybe talking to someone who's sitting in the passenger side seat. Where it's not going to come into play is if they turn their head this way because they go off axis to the microphone. It's going to be side addressing them and it's going to sound a little bit awkward off mic. So you would want to have a second type of microphone over here to pick that up or position the microphone better. Now you're probably not going to be able to configure it up here directly in line because not only would it be distracting to the actors in their performance, being only a foot or so away from their mouth, but it's also going to be probably in the way of the lighting, so you don't want to end up doing this. However, you may be in a scenario where you could put it up here, or better yet, if it's a sequence where they're not looking anywhere other than front and side, you may be able to put it in the visor on the passenger side. And unfortunately, because I have the cube up there, it's not going to go very well. But I'm going to place it up there as if it were where it would normally be. And it's not directly on axis to my mouth. It's currently facing right about here. And this is how it sounds as a car plant. I'm going to be side addressing it ever so slightly as I'm driving down the road this way while I'm looking this direction and then looking over at the person that I'm performing with. But this is approximately how it would sound as a plant microphone. Before I tell you my thoughts, I'm going to point out a couple of things that you may not have considered. Number one, I was a little bit off in some of my distances, but you can see on the screen how far away the microphone is away from my mouth. So if I said it's 2 feet over my head and it's close to 18 inches or vice versa, bear with me. I was a little bit off in my distances, so don't sue me on this, okay? You could see what it was on the screen. I wasn't trying to keep anything from you. The second thing I'm going to point out is my voice is a little bit higher pitched than your voice may be. So if you don't sound exactly like me, which I'm sure you don't, and if you do, I'm sorry, then you can take what I say with a grain of salt because it's going to be basically my opinion is going to be based on my voice and how I sound on all these microphones. That said, here are my thoughts. Visually, the 3 and the 3S are more or less the same. They're basically the same looking interference tube with a couple of small differences. Let me point those out to you. First of all, the interference tubes have the same spacing, the same cut depth of the vents going up and down the actual interference tube itself. However, when you look at the end, the 3 has a diagonal cut tube while the 3S has more of a square cut tube. At the end, the vents are also sliced thinner on the 3 and there's an extra cut in them over the 3S. Now, does it matter? Not necessarily, it's all in the engineering, but there are two other little bitty minor things. Number one is you can tell when you look over here that the microphone interference tube was not just cut off when it comes down to the S. It actually has a little bit of a buffer there, just like it is on the 3. So it's not just cut off. It's actually engineered to be this way. The other thing I'm going to point out is that there are no screws visual on the outside of the 3S, but on the 3, there is one little screw right there. Oh, big deal there. With regards to the specifications of the 3 versus the 3S, they're basically the same, with the exception of the interference tube length, which causes a change in the off-axis rejection. And if you look right here, you'll see on the screen the specifications between the two of them, and there's only a little bit more rejection on the 3 than the 3S. But it is something to note. Off-axis rejection does matter when it comes down to sound because when you reject out more of the outside noises from the side, you're going to be hearing more of the sounds coming straight down the barrel. So the 3 has an advantage over the 3S in basically every one of the real-world environments. Now, inside the studio, it was a little different because there is no outside noises to reject out when you have acoustic treatment all around you. I'll get to that in a bit. When creating two microphones that are basically the same with different interference tubes, there is going to be a difference in the engineering. You can't just cut off the interference tube and then call it a shorter version of the microphone. You have to tweak the specifications a little bit and tweak the engineering design a little bit to make it work. And with the 3S, I think it does work compared to the 3. Both the 3 and the 3S sounded more or less the same until you got farther than about 2 feet off mic, maybe 2.5 feet depending on the test. But the reason for this is that the shorter interference tube started allowing in more of the outside sounds to come down the barrel, and that's going to affect your way of hearing a sound. The more the interference tube is closed in, the more bass you're going to get. It's the same thing as if you have your ears and you're hearing through your ears and then you simply close off your ear canal using your finger, you're going to start to hear a lot more bass. Same kind of thing happens when you start to close off more of the interference tube and you're hearing through a smaller area coming down the barrel. That's just the nature of the acoustics, and the smaller interference tube is going to allow you to hear more of the background noises and lose the bass at a farther distance. For this reason, the 3 pulls out more bass in my voice from 3 feet all the way up to 16 feet, far better than the 3S. Personally, if background noise isn't an issue, I would like the way my voice sounds on the 3S from more or less about a foot away off the mic. In the 3, closer to 1.5 feet off the mic. Now, why is this? Because when you start to get too close with the microphone, you start to get a little bit more of that proximity effect, but more importantly, the mouth crispies, all the smacking type sounds that your mouth naturally makes, the popping and clicks, those are much more noticeable when you're inside of those distances. I like the way it sounds, don't get me wrong with regards to the rejection and stuff like that, but the actual sound quality of my voice, I personally prefer at those distances off the microphone, provided there's not too much background noise. In the quiet exterior, there was a roof, which means that the 3 was actually picking up more of the reflections off the ground and then bouncing off and catching more of those reflections off the ceiling than the 3S was. And for that reason, personally, I think there was more cancellation on the 3 than the 3S, and the 3S to me sounded better in that kind of an environment. So if you're ever shooting in a breezeway, you may get better results off of the 3S than you would the 3. In my garage, though, there was no background noise and there were walls. So what did that do to the acoustics? Well, on the 3, it still did the same kind of thing. It was still picking up more of those reflected sounds going back and forth between the floor and the ceiling, thereby causing cancellation. But if I got more than about 3 feet overhead, that's when the fullness of the 3S started to fall off, and that's when the 3 started to sound better. So within that distance, I personally preferred the 3S to the 3, mainly because it wasn't canceling out nearly as much, but after about 3 feet, the 3S is going to lose to the 3. In my testing with the 3 versus the 3S and the 416, I want to point out a couple of things. First of all, the detail of the 416 is higher, and for that reason, you're picking up a lot more of the mouth crispies and popping and clicking noises, just like you would a Neumann U87 or some other premium microphone. Those microphones are extremely unforgiving. They pick up every little bitty pop and crinkle of your voice, which may make it more difficult for you to do post-processing on it. So for that reason, I personally like the way that I sounded on the 3 and the 3S over the 416 in this controlled environment. The 416 is a very good microphone. It is a very premium microphone, 2.5 times the cost of the 3. However, I think that you're going to end up giving yourself more work in post if you're trying to compensate for all those mouth crispies. You might have to run it through a DS or maybe declick, that kind of processing, over if you use the Deity S-Mic 3 or the 3S. Those are a little bit less detailed, but it's going to give you more of the sound that you're looking for as a rule. Now, there's exceptions to this. You may prefer to have that extra fat signal from the 416, just like you might with a TLM 103 or a U87 or some other extremely highly detailed premium microphone, and that's fine. That may be your preference. But personally, if you don't want to end up doing nearly as much post-processing, you want to be really good sounding out of the case, basically, I think you're going to get results that are going to be very favorable to you with very little post if you use the 3 or the 3S. Personally, this is why, as a rule, I'm not a huge fan of the 416 in a controlled booth type environment. If you have a really rich, deep, bassy voice, sure, you're going to sound great no matter what you speak into. And the 416 is no exception there. But if you have a higher pitched voice like me, the 416 and that added presence boost is not going to really do you any favors. It's going to make you sound a little bit overly harsh. And that's something that personally I'm not a fan of. You may love the way you sound on a 416, and that's fine. Use it. More power to you if that's what you want to do. However, do you end up doing so much post-processing on it that by the time you're done with it, it doesn't sound like the 416 anymore? If that's the case, let me ask you this. Would you find yourself doing less post-processing if you use the Deity S-Mic 3 instead? Because I would do less post-processing on the 3 because I think the 3 would sound more like I would want to be as a finished product than the 416. The 3S is the same exact way. In a controlled environment, I personally like the way that I sound on the 3S even more so than the 3 because the 3 kind of dials in and pulls in and extracts surgically the sound that it's basically pointing at, the mouth. But the 3S is a little bit wider, so it's able to pull out a little bit more of the sound resonating off of my forehead, my cheeks, my tongue, my chest even. It's going to pull all of that sound out a little bit better. And because it's not trying to reach and reject at the same time, it sounds fuller to my ears. Your perspective after listening to my audio comparisons could be completely different from mine, and that's fine. It's the way you hear it. You got to be happy with the way that you sound in your audio recordings. For that reason, if you have 2 different microphones and you have to do post-processing galore on one, but the other one is pretty much great out of the case, which one would you rather have if the results are basically the same to your ears? Because of the low profile nature, I only use the 3S inside of my car as a plant microphone, and I like the way it sounded. When I first heard it, I had to think about it and say, you know what, I wasn't overly happy, but then what I was hearing is the acoustics in my car. It sounded like my car. Many cars are going to sound that way until you run it through a little mild post-processing, and then it's going to fatten up and it's going to sound more like we would expect it to hear in a movie. But when it comes down to raw tracks, the 3S does a great job at, in my opinion. Not as well when it comes up from underneath, but when it comes in from straight in front of me or from overhead, it sounds great in my opinion. Performance-wise, I really do like the way the 3 and the 3S sounds over the 2 and the 2S. But why is there such a big difference when the specifications are basically the same? Because resonance matters, and a brass microphone resonates different than aluminum. There's a reason why many microphones are made out of aluminum. It's because the resonation works really well for a microphone. And for that reason, to me, the 3 and the 3S sound so much better than the 2 and the 2S. And I did like the sound of the 2, much more so than the 2S. The 2S I wasn't overly fond with, but to me, I think that the difference in the microphone material that it's made of, the actual resonation of the aluminum, makes the difference when it comes down to the 3 and the 3S. To me, the 3 sounds a lot better than the 2, and the 3S, it makes it actually usable, in my opinion, in a situation other than just needing a low-profile type microphone. So to me, the aluminum is a win. and you don't really lack any, RF resilience or something like that in my testing. In conclusion, I like both the 3 and the 3S for different reasons in different type environments. In this kind of controlled environment, I would probably opt for more of the 3S myself. It doesn't need to be overly far away from my mouth. It's still going to reject out my screen and any reflections off of that just fine. As a matter of fact, it might even do that better than the 3S if there's any kind of a bad, harsh type reflection behind me, but it picks up my voice just fine. It's a nice full fat signal. And to me, it's not lacking in detail or anything as long as you use it fairly close. Likewise, the 3S in an environment where there's going to be potential reflections bouncing off, standing waves, you might like the 3S better than the 3. In pretty much any other type environment, especially those that you have to deal with off-axis rejection, the 3 is probably going to give you better results. So keep this in mind. Now, thank you for tuning into this episode of SoundSpeeds. Be sure to tune in the future for more microphone reviews, more testing, and things to think about. And as always, sound advice. Have a question you'd like answered or want to add something? Be sure to write it in the comment section down below. You can also make a suggestion for future topics of discussion. Again, comment section down below, or you can email me at soundspeeds@yahoo.com. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss out on future sound advice.